My mother died on a Tuesday in late March, and the first thing her attorney told me, before condolences, before paperwork, before anything that resembled a normal conversation between two adults handling a death, was that she had specifically instructed him not to put the house on the market under any circumstances. He said it the way a man delivers a diagnosis. He said it twice. He said the house at 4418 Lindenmere Drive in Coldwater, Ohio, was now legally mine, and that my mother's written instructions, signed and notarized 11 years earlier, made it clear the property was not to be sold, not to be rented, not to be listed, and not to be left empty for longer than 30 consecutive days. He said the 30-day clause was unusual enough that he had asked her about it at the time, and that she had told him, with the calm of a woman who had already finished arguing with herself, that the clause was not negotiable, and that if he was not comfortable drafting it, he could refer her to another firm. He had drafted it. He had not asked again. I asked him why. He told me my mother had not explained, and that he had not pressed her. I want to be honest about who I am, because the rest of what I'm going to tell you depends on it. My name is Hannah Reeve. I'm 38 years old. I've worked as a residential real estate appraiser for 14 years, mostly in the Cincinnati metro area. I don't believe houses have moods. I don't believe houses remember. My professional life is built on the principle that a structure is the sum of its measurable parts, square footage, roof age, comparable sales within a half-mile radius, foundation cracks, joist spans, the slope of the lot, and that anything which cannot be entered into a column on a standardized form does not belong in the report. Banks hire me when they need a number that will hold up in court. That is what I am, and that is what I trusted. The afternoon I drove up to Coldwater for the first time in 19 years. So when the attorney told me my mother had legally chained me to a 4-bedroom colonial in a town I had not lived in since I was 19, I did what a person in my profession does. I drove up to Coldwater that weekend with a clipboard, a moisture meter, a flashlight, and the assumption that within an afternoon I would understand why a 67-year-old widow with no debt and no obvious eccentricity had written such a strange clause into her will. I assumed the answer would be ordinary. Maybe a lien I didn't know about. Maybe a verbal agreement with a neighbor. Maybe a sentimental attachment dressed up as a legal instrument. I had seen 1,000 variations on the same theme, people who could not let go of houses for reasons that, once you sat down with them, turned out to be reasons of the heart and not of the property. What I found over the next 11 weeks was that the house itself was not the mystery. The neighborhood was. Coldwater sits in Mercer County in the western flat of Ohio, the kind of place where the cornfields press right up against the town limits, and the water tower still has the high school's graduation year painted on it in a different color every June. Lindenmere Drive is a curved residential street near the south edge of town. 6 houses on each side. No through traffic, the kind of street where a stranger's car gets noticed inside of 40 seconds. My mother had lived there for 31 years. I had grown up there from age 6 to age 19. I knew the street the way you know a song you stopped listening to in high school, the general shape of it. The rhythm of who lived where, the small landmarks a child uses to navigate. The Hendlers 2 doors down, in the White House with the green shutters. The Marwicks across the street, who had hung the same wreath on their door every December for as long as I could remember. Old Mr. Pelham on the corner with the flagpole that he raised every morning and lowered every evening, even in winter. The Brunsons next to him, who kept a vegetable garden so disciplined it looked surveyed, every row at a measured distance from the next, every stake hammered in at the same depth. I pulled into my mother's driveway on a Saturday afternoon in early April, and the first thing I noticed was that every single one of those families was still there. Not their children, not their grandchildren. Them, the same people, in the same houses, 19 years after I'd left. That, by itself, was not impossible. People stay, people age in place. In a small Ohio town, that's not even unusual. What was unusual was that they had all come outside at roughly the same time, within 4 or 5 minutes of my arrival, and were standing in their respective yards doing small, invented tasks. Mr. Pelham was adjusting his flag rope, working at a knot that did not appear to need adjusting. Mrs. Hendler was watering a flower bed that did not need water. I could see the dark, wet soil from my driveway. The Brunsons were both kneeling at the edge of their garden, not weeding, just kneeling, the way you kneel when you have decided to be outside, but have not yet decided what to do with your hands. Mrs. Marwick was on her porch with a coffee cup that I would later realize was empty, held at chest height, in a way that no one holds a cup of coffee they are actually drinking. None of them waved. None of them came over. They watched me unlock the front door of my mother's house, and then, in a loose and unhurried sequence, they all went back inside. Mr. Pelham last. He stood at the base of his flagpole for almost a full minute after the others had gone in, looking in my direction without expression, before he turned and walked up his porch steps and closed his door. I stood in the foyer for a long time before I set my bag down. The house smelled like my mother. That's the part I wasn't ready for. Cedar from the hall closet, a faint trace of the lavender hand cream she used at night. The particular dryness of a house heated by a forced air furnace in a dry winter. Her reading glasses were on the kitchen table next to a half-finished crossword. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove was correct to the minute. A glass on the counter held an inch of water that had not yet evaporated. It was a house that had been left for 10 days, not a house that had been abandoned. Someone, I realized, had been inside it during that time, adjusting things, keeping things current. The thermostat read 68, the temperature my mother had kept it at since I was a child. I did what I'd come to do. I walked the rooms with my clipboard. I checked the basement for moisture intrusion and found none. I checked the attic for roof leaks and found none. I tested every outlet on the main floor. I ran the kitchen faucet for 2 minutes and watched the pressure hold steady. I opened every window. The house was, by every measurable standard, in better condition than a house of its age had any right to be. The HVAC was new. The roof was new. The water heater had been replaced in 2022. The electrical panel upgraded in 2019. The windows in 2017. My mother had been on a fixed income from my father's pension since 2014. The numbers did not work. She could not have afforded any of it. The math, when I ran it on the kitchen table with a pen and the back of an envelope, was off by something on the order of $70,000 over the last decade. I sat at her kitchen table with the crossword in front of me and tried to think about that calmly. My mother had not been the kind of woman who hid money. She had not been the kind of woman who took loans. She had been the kind of woman who balanced her checkbook on the first Saturday of every month and who told me, on more than one phone call, exactly how much she had in her savings account, down to the dollar. The doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Hendler from 2 doors down. She was holding a casserole dish covered in tinfoil, and she was smiling, and her smile did not match the rest of her face. Her eyes were doing something else. They were measuring me, the way you measure a piece of furniture you are about to lift, to see if it will fit through the doorway. She said she was so sorry about my mother. She said she had brought tuna noodle, which my mother had always liked. She said the neighborhood had been hoping I would come, and that everyone was glad I was here, and that I should not worry about anything because the street took care of its own. I thanked her. I took the casserole. I asked her because asking people things is part of the job, whether she happened to know the contractor my mother had used for the recent renovations. Mrs. Hendler's smile did not change, but something underneath it shifted, the way a floor shifts under a heavy piece of furniture you didn't realize was being moved. A faint adjustment, a redistribution of weight. She said my mother had not used a contractor. She said the street had done the work. Then she said good night, even though it was 4 in the afternoon, and she walked back to her house without looking back. She did not turn at the end of my walkway. She did not glance toward Mrs. Marwick's porch. She walked the 2 houses to her own front door at the same steady pace, opened it, went inside, and closed it behind her. I want to say I dismissed that. I want to say I told myself she was an old woman being neighborly and using strange phrasing. But I'd been inside the house for 40 minutes. The electrical panel upgrade alone was a $1,500 job that requires a licensed electrician and a permit pulled with the city. The windows were a $20,000 replacement. You don't get those done by a neighborhood. You get those done by people with insurance and trucks and federal tax ID numbers. You get those done by people who do not live on your street, who arrive in marked vehicles, and who leave invoices with a return address in another zip code. I went down to the basement and found the permit folder my mother kept in a metal filing cabinet by the workbench. I expected to find nothing. I found the opposite. Every permit was there. Everyone was properly filed with the city of Coldwater. Everyone had a contractor's name on it. The electrical work had been done by a company called Hendler Electrical Services. The window replacement had been done by Marwick Glass and Glazing. The roof had been done by Pelham Roofing and Exteriors. The HVAC had been installed by Brunson Heating and Air. Every single business was registered to a Lindenmere Drive address. I sat on the concrete floor of my mother's basement with the folder open in my lap, and I cross-referenced, because cross-referencing is the part of the work that has saved me, over the years, from a great many small embarrassments. I pulled up the Mercer County Business Registry on my phone. Hendler Electrical Services had been founded in 1971, Marwick Glass and Glazing in 1968. Pelham Roofing in 1964, Brunson Heating and Air in 1969. All 4 companies were still active. All 4 had filed taxes the previous year. All 4 listed only the original founder as the registered agent. Not a son, not a grandson, not a successor. The original founder. The same man, in each case, who had been listed on the founding paperwork more than 50 years earlier. Mr. Pelham was 86 years old. I knew because my mother had mentioned his birthday in a phone call 3 years ago. She had said it had been a small gathering, just the families on the street, and that he had cut the cake himself. I went back upstairs. The sun was setting. The street outside the kitchen window looked the way it had always looked. Except that now, in 3 of the houses I could see from where I was standing, a single light had come on in an upstairs window, even though it was still light enough outside that no one would have needed one. The lights were not bright. They were the soft, low light of a bedside lamp, set deep into a room, visible through curtains. They were not on for reading. They were on for signaling. I told myself I was tired. I told myself the long drive had made me suggestible. I told myself I would call the attorney on Monday and ask him, plainly, what my mother had been involved in, and whether anything in her file gave context for the clause in the will. I told myself there was a rational explanation, and that I would find it, and that I would be back in Cincinnati by Wednesday with the house listed under a probate exemption and a for sale sign in the front yard within the month. Then I noticed the casserole dish on the counter. Mrs. Hendler had not actually brought tuna noodle. She had brought a covered dish, and I had thanked her for it without looking, and now, in the kitchen light, I could see that the tinfoil was crimped down over something that was not food. There was no weight in the dish when I lifted it, no condensation under the foil. I peeled it back. Inside the casserole dish, arranged neatly in a single layer, were a stack of envelopes, maybe 30 of them. Each one was addressed in my mother's handwriting. Each one was addressed to me. None of them had ever been mailed. The stamps were on. The return address was filled in. The envelopes had simply never left the house. The top envelope was dated 4 months before her death. The bottom envelope was dated 19 years ago, the week I left for college. I sat down at the kitchen table where my mother had done her crossword, and I opened the oldest envelope first, because that's how the work taught me you start with the foundation. You start at the bottom of the structure and work your way up. I unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, and I read what my mother had written to me 3 days after she dropped me off at the dorms in Cincinnati. The handwriting was hers. The paper was hers. The cream-colored stationery she had kept in the drawer of the secretary in the dining room, with her initials embossed at the top. It said, "Hannah, I should have told you before you left, but I couldn't make my mouth do it. The house has agreed to let you go, but only because you are my child. That is the only reason. If you come back to live here before I die, the agreement resets and you stay. Please do not come back. Please do not come back. Please do not come back." I read it 3 times. Then I got up, very calmly, and I walked to the front window, and I looked out at Lindenmere Drive in the last of the evening light. Every porch light on the street was on. Every single one. 12 houses, 12 porch lights. They had not been on when I arrived. They had not been on when Mrs. Hendler walked back to her house. They had come on, all of them, sometime between then and now, while I had been reading. And in the yard directly across from my mother's house, Mrs. Marwick was standing on her front lawn in the cold April dusk, facing my window, with her empty coffee cup still in her hand, watching me read. I did not sleep in the house that first night. I drove 23 minutes to a Hampton Inn off the state route, paid for a room with my own card, and sat on the edge of the bed with all 30 envelopes laid out on the comforter in chronological order. I had carried them out of my mother's house in a paper grocery bag, the way you carry something you do not want to be seen carrying. The desk clerk at the Hampton Inn had been a young woman from a town 2 counties over, and she had not recognized my last name when I gave it to her, which was, in that moment, the most comforting thing that had happened to me all day. I read the letters in the order my mother had written them, which is the order I should describe them in now, because the sequence matters. The early letters, from the first 6 or 7 years after I left, were short. My mother repeated herself. She told me, in slightly different phrasings each time, that the house had let me go and that I should not come back. She told me she was sorry she had never explained. She told me she would explain in person someday, and then, in the next letter, she would apologize for not having done so. The handwriting in those years was tight and controlled, the handwriting of a woman who was writing down something she did not want to leave a record of, but could not stop herself from writing. Several of the early letters had the same opening line. "Hannah, I am writing this on a Sunday afternoon because the house is quiet on Sunday afternoons." I counted that line 7 times before I stopped counting. The middle letters, from roughly 2011 onward, began to describe specifics. My mother wrote that the agreement was older than the houses on the street. She wrote that the agreement was not with the houses, but with the ground underneath them. She wrote that my father had known, and that my father had been the one who originally explained it to her, and that he had asked her to stay after he was gone, because leaving was no longer one of the available options for anyone who had lived on Lindenmere Drive for more than 5 years. She did not explain what not available meant, in concrete terms. She wrote around it. She used phrases like "the houses do not allow it," and "the street holds its own," and, in one letter from 2013, the sentence "the well does not let names go once it has copied them down." That was the first time the word well appeared in any of the letters. It would appear after that in almost every one. My father had died in 2014. He had been a quiet man, a bookkeeper for a feed cooperative 2 towns over. He had grown up in Coldwater, in the house at 4418 Lindenmere Drive, which his parents had owned before us. We had moved in when his mother died in 1987, the same year I had turned 1, the same year, I would later learn, that my name had been written onto the rotation. My father had not talked about his childhood much. He had not talked about his parents much either. I had assumed, for most of my life, that this was the ordinary reticence of a small-town Midwestern man of his generation. I no longer assumed that. The later letters from the last 5 years of my mother's life were the ones I had the hardest time with. In those, she stopped trying to explain the system and began trying to apologize for being part of it. She wrote that she had attended what she called the meetings for 31 years. She wrote that the meetings happened 4 times a year in the basement of the Brunson house, and that attendance was not optional, and that what was discussed at the meetings was the maintenance schedule. She wrote that the maintenance schedule had 2 columns. One column was for the houses, the other column was for the people. She wrote that my name had been added to the second column the year I was born. She wrote that she had spent her entire adult life trying to keep it from being moved to the active section. I want to say I dismissed the letters. I want to say I read them and concluded that my mother had spent her last years in cognitive decline, that the family had failed to catch. But the letters were not the letters of a woman in decline. The handwriting was steady across 19 years. The grammar was clean. The chronology was internally consistent with events referenced in 2018, had been foreshadowed in 2009, names mentioned in passing in 2011 reappeared with full context in 2016, and the letters described, in their own terms, the exact thing I had observed with my own eyes that afternoon. A street where the same people had stayed in the same houses for an unreasonably long time, where 4 families operated 4 contracting businesses out of their personal addresses, where the homeowners' improvements had been done by the homeowners' neighbors, and where my arrival had triggered a coordinated, watchful welcome from people who had not waved. I lay awake until almost 3 in the morning. I did not turn off the bedside lamp. I drove back to Lindenmere Drive at 9 the next morning. It was Sunday. The street was empty in the way small-town streets are empty on Sunday mornings, with the particular emptiness of people who are in church or sleeping late, or simply choosing to stay indoors. I let myself into my mother's house. I sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes with a cup of coffee I had brought from the hotel, because I did not want to use her water. And I made a list on a yellow legal pad of every concrete thing I could verify without leaving the property. The first thing I verified was the basement. My mother's letter from 2019 had said the meetings happened in the basement of the Brunson house. The Brunson house was directly behind ours, with its backyard touching ours. The 2 basements would not connect. They were separated by 60 feet of yard, 2 foundations, and the property line. But the letter had also mentioned, almost in passing, that my mother's basement had a service door that she had never used and had asked me never to ask about when I was a child. I went down the basement stairs. I knew that basement well. It was where I had done laundry from age 12 to age 19. It had a finished half on the east side and an unfinished half on the west side, with the furnace and the water heater and my father's old workbench. There was no service door. There had never been a service door as far as I had ever known. I walked the perimeter slowly, with the flashlight from my appraisal kit. I was looking for the kind of inconsistency a renovation creates when a wall has been recently moved. Drywall seams, paint color mismatch, outlet placement that doesn't make sense for the room. The kind of small visual errors that a homeowner stops noticing within a week of finishing a project, but which a trained eye picks up the moment it walks in. I found it behind the workbench. The workbench was bolted to the wall, but the bolts were new. The original bench had been freestanding on 4 legs. I knew because I had helped my father move it twice, once in 1998 when we'd painted the basement floor, once in 2003 when he had wanted to put down rubber matting. I pulled the bench away from the wall, the bolts coming out of the cinder block with the easy resistance of fasteners that had been intended to be removed, and behind it, set into the wall, was a steel door, not a hatch, a door, painted the same color as the basement walls. No handle on this side, just hinges and a flat steel plate where a knob should have been. The hinges were heavy. They were not the hinges of an interior door. They were the kind of hinges used on a door that was meant to hold pressure. I sat on the basement floor and stared at it for a long time. Then I went back upstairs because I am not a person who opens a door in a basement without first understanding what is on the other side of it. The next thing I verified was the contractor records. I had already pulled up the Mercer County Business Registry on my phone the night before. Now I went deeper. I logged into a paid database that my appraisal firm subscribes to, the kind that aggregates property records, business filings, and lien histories across multiple states. I searched for any building permit issued in the city of Coldwater for any address on Lindenmere Drive in the last 40 years. The result was a list of 314 permits. Every single house on the street had been under near-continuous improvement since 1984. New roofs every 12 to 15 years. New windows every 18. New HVAC every 10. New electrical panels every 20. The pattern was so consistent across all 12 houses that it could not have been the product of individual homeowner decisions. It was a maintenance schedule, a coordinated multi-decade maintenance schedule, executed by 4 contracting companies owned by 4 families on the street who had been doing this work on each other's houses and on my mother's house since before I was born. The contractors had not pulled outside work. I checked. Hendler Electrical Services had never filed a permit for any address that was not on Lindenmere Drive. Same for Marwick Glass, Pelham Roofing, and Brunson Heating. 4 contracting businesses, in continuous operation for over 50 years, that had only ever worked on 12 houses. That was the thing that broke through what was left of my professional skepticism, because a contracting business that only services one street is not a contracting business. It is a cover. It is a legal mechanism for moving money and labor around a closed system without ever generating an external invoice. It is the kind of arrangement that the IRS would describe, in its driest possible language, as not arm's length. And it had been operating in plain sight in a small Ohio town since the Nixon administration. I made a second list. On this one, I wrote down the names of every adult I could remember from my childhood on Lindenmere Drive, and next to each name, I wrote the year I had last confirmed they were alive. When I finished, I had 23 names. 19 of them were people I had seen, with my own eyes, standing in their yards the previous afternoon. The other 4 were people who had died. But here's what I want you to understand about that list, because it is the part that took me the longest to accept. The 4 who had died were not the 4 I would have expected. They were not the oldest. They were not the sickest. They were, in fact, the 4 people from my childhood whom I remembered as the most independent. Mr. Kasprack, who had refused to let the Brunsons mow his lawn and who had hired an outside service from Selena to do it instead. Mrs. Otwell, who had put her house on the market in 1998 and then quietly taken it off 2 weeks later, without ever telling anyone why. The Lindquists, who had been a younger couple with no children, and who had announced at a block party in 2003 that they were moving to Arizona. None of them had moved to Arizona. I sat in my mother's kitchen and ran the obituaries on my phone. Mr. Kasprak had died in 1996 of what the local paper called a sudden illness. Mrs. Otwell had died in 1999, 3 months after she took her house off the market, of what the paper called complications following a fall at home. The Lindquists had died together in 2004, in what the paper called a private tragedy at their residence, with no further detail, no funeral notices, no survivors listed. The obituaries had been 4 lines long apiece. 3 deaths, 3 houses. All 3 houses, I now noticed, were on the list of 314 permits. All 3 had been renovated extensively in the year following their owners' deaths. All 3 were currently occupied by families I did not recognize from my childhood families, who, according to the property records I now pulled, had purchased the houses below market value in transactions that closed within 60 days of the previous owner's death. The street had replaced them. I want to be careful with my language here, because what I am describing is not, technically, evidence of a crime. People die. Houses get sold. New families move in. None of what I had assembled on my second day back in Coldwater would have meant anything to a police officer. It was a pattern. Patterns are what appraisers see. Patterns are not, by themselves, proof. What made it more than a pattern was the doorbell. It rang at 11:15 on Sunday morning. I had been at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours. When I opened the door, Mr. Brunson was standing on the porch. He was 79 years old. He was wearing the same kind of zip-front cardigan my father used to wear. He was holding a clipboard. He said good morning, and he asked if I had a few minutes to talk about the spring maintenance. I asked him what spring maintenance. He looked at me with what I want to call patience, but which was actually something colder, something more like the look an experienced surveyor gives a piece of land he has measured many times before. He said the spring maintenance for the house. He said it was scheduled for the 3rd week of April every year, and that the schedule had been set a long time ago, and that he was sorry to bother me so soon after my mother's passing, but that the timing was not flexible. I asked him what work, specifically, was scheduled. He looked down at his clipboard. He read from it. He said the soffits needed to be checked on the north side of the house. He said the sump pump needed to be tested. He said the chimney flashing had a 5-year inspection cycle and was due this year. He said the basement floor drain needed to be cleared. The last item on his list was the service door. I asked him what service door. He looked up at me, and for the first time his face did something that was not patient. It was not threatening either. It was something more difficult to describe. It was the face of a man who realizes that the person he is talking to does not yet know the rules, and who is trying to decide, in real time, whether to be the one who explains them. He said, very quietly, that my mother had asked them, before she died, to give me time. He said they had agreed to give me 30 days. He said that 30 days was the longest the house could be left unattended under the terms of the agreement, and that we were now on day 11, and that he was here today not because the maintenance needed to be done this minute, but because he wanted to be the one to tell me, before someone else did, that I would need to decide soon whether I was going to keep the schedule or break it. I asked him what would happen if I broke it. He said he didn't know. He said the schedule had never been broken in his lifetime. He said his father had told him, when he was 19 years old and being shown the basement of his own house for the first time, that the schedule was older than the street, and that the schedule did not exist for the benefit of the people on the street. He said the schedule existed for the benefit of whatever was underneath the street, and that the people on the street were the maintenance crew, not the customers. He said that one more time, slowly, as if he wanted me to remember the exact phrasing. The people on the street are the maintenance crew, not the customers. Then he handed me his clipboard. There was a sheet of paper clipped to it. It was a schedule, a 4 times a year schedule of meetings, work orders, and what the schedule called rotations. The next meeting was in 5 days, on Friday evening at 7 o'clock, in the basement of the Brunson house. My mother's name had been crossed out in pencil. My name had been written in underneath it, in the same handwriting as the rest of the schedule, in ink that looked like it had been there for years. I asked Mr. Brunson when my name had been added. He said it had been on the schedule since 1987. I had been 1 year old. I did not go to the meeting on Friday. I want to say that first because what I did instead was, in its own way, worse, and I want to be honest about the order of my decisions. After Mr. Brunson left the porch on Sunday morning, I drove to the Mercer County Recorder's office in Salina, the county seat, and I waited outside the building for it to open on Monday. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 40 minutes with a thermos of coffee and the clipboard Mr. Brunson had left with me on the passenger seat. The schedule was still clipped to it. I had read it 11 times by then. The rotations column was the part I could not stop looking at. Each rotation entry had a date, a house number, and a single initial. My mother's last entry was dated February of the previous year. The initial next to her name was a letter I did not recognize as standing for anything I knew about her. It was the letter K. The other entries on the schedule had other letters next to them. R for the Brunsons, M for the Pelhams, T for the Hendlers. The letters were not initials of names. They were not initials of months or directions or any system I could puzzle out from the clipboard alone. They were a code. And the code was old enough that no one on the street, I suspected, would have been able to tell me any more where it came from, only what it meant in practice. The recorder's office opened at 8. I told the woman at the counter that I was researching the chain of title on a property I had inherited, and I asked to see the original plat map for the Lindenmere Drive subdivision. She brought me a paper folder from the back. Inside it was a single sheet, brown at the edges, dated 1952. The plat showed the curve of the street, the 12 lots, the easement at the center. The developer's name was printed across the bottom margin in block letters. The subdivision had been platted by a developer named Aldrich Coldwater Holdings. I had grown up in a town called Coldwater. I had never, in 38 years, considered that the town's name might be the name of a person. I asked the woman at the counter if she knew anything about Aldrich Coldwater. She said she didn't, but she said the Historical Society on Main Street had a small archive that might. I drove there next. The Historical Society was a converted storefront with a hand-painted sign in the front window and a volunteer staff of 2 retirees. The woman on duty was named Dolores. She was in her 70s. She had not grown up in Coldwater. She had married into it in 1971, which, by the standards of the families I was researching, made her a recent arrival. I asked her about Aldrich Coldwater. She went very still for a moment. Then she walked to a back room and came out with a thin, acid-free folder that had been filed under a name I did not see. She set it on the table in front of me, and she said, in a voice that was not quite a whisper but was not the voice she had used a moment before, that I should read it there, in the building, and that I should not photograph any of it, and that, when I was done, I should put it back in her hands and not leave it on the table. I asked her why. She said the folder had been donated with conditions, and that she had honored those conditions for 46 years, and that she did not intend to stop honoring them now. She said I could read whatever was inside. She did not say anything else. The folder contained 4 documents. The first was a single-page biography of Aldrich Coldwater, who had founded the town in 1851. He had been a Methodist circuit preacher from Pennsylvania who had purchased 200 acres of swampland in what was then Mercer County, drained it over the course of 9 years, and laid out a town grid centered on a freshwater spring that the local Wyandotte had used as a meeting site. He had named the town after the spring. He had died in 1879 of unspecified causes. The biography noted in a single line at the bottom of the page that the original 12 households of the settlement had each been deeded their lots by Coldwater personally, without payment, in exchange for what the biography called a perpetual covenant of stewardship. The phrase was not explained. The second document was a hand-drawn map of the original town site, dated 1858. The spring was marked at the center. Around it, in a rough circle, were 12 property lots. The lots were not numbered. They were lettered, A through L. The lettering was in a careful draftsman's hand, each letter capitalized, each lot drawn to roughly the same dimensions. The third document was a list. It was titled in old-fashioned cursive, "The Articles of Maintenance." It was dated 1861. It had been signed by 12 men, one for each lettered lot, and it laid out, in plain language, an agreement among the 12 households to maintain the works above the water in perpetuity, in exchange for what the document called the steady benefit of the water below. The document specified that the agreement passed with the deed. It specified that any household that abandoned its lot forfeited its claim to the benefit, and that any household that broke the schedule of maintenance would be replaced by the remaining 11 through means the document did not name. The phrasing was careful. The document was a contract. Whoever had drafted it had been a man with legal training, working from a template that he had presumably adapted from some other instrument. A partnership agreement, perhaps, or a deed of trust. The fourth document was a photograph. It was a copy of a photograph, taken sometime in the 1920s by the look of the clothing, of the same 12 lots from a slight elevation. The houses had been built by then. They were not the houses that stood on Lindenmere Drive today. They were older, smaller, wood-framed, with steep roofs and front porches that ran the width of each house. But the layout was identical. 12 houses in a curved arc around a central feature. In the original photograph, the central feature was a low stone wellhead, surrounded by a wooden fence. In the modern subdivision, the central feature was the backyards, the space where the 12 backyards met. I had grown up backing onto that space. We had called it the easement. The city had mowed it twice a year. My father had told me, when I was 8, that it was a drainage retention area and that I was not allowed to play in it. I had obeyed that instruction the way children obey instructions whose reasoning they do not understand, with intermittent compliance and a slow erosion of curiosity over time. I had played at the edges of the easement a few times as a child. I had never walked to the center. I asked Dolores how the Historical Society had come to have the folder. She said it had been donated in 1978 by a man named Earl Pelham, who had been on the city council at the time and who had cleaned out the attic of the original Coldwater meeting hall before it was demolished. She said Earl Pelham had brought the folder in personally and had asked the society to file it under a name that was not Coldwater and not Lindenmere. He had asked her to file it under the name of the spring. I asked her what the spring was called. She said it had been called Kettering's Mouth. I asked her to spell it. She did. Kettering''S. The initial next to my mother's name on the rotation schedule was a K. I sat at the table in the Historical Society for almost an hour after that. Dolores did not interrupt me. She made tea on a hot plate in the back and brought me a cup of it without asking. I closed the folder eventually, and I handed it back to her, and I asked her, because I had to ask, whether she knew anyone else who had come in over the years and asked about Aldrich Coldwater or Kettering's Mouth. She said 3 people had asked in 46 years. She said one had been a graduate student from Ohio State in 1991, who had been writing a thesis on Methodist settlement patterns in northwestern Ohio. She said the graduate student had read the folder, had thanked her, and had left, and had never published anything that Dolores was able to find. The other 2, she said, had been residents of Lindenmere Drive once in 1989, once in 2007, and both of them had asked her, after reading the folder, whether they could take it with them. She had said no both times. They had not pressed. They had thanked her and left. I asked her if she remembered who they had been. She said the first had been a man named Lindquist. The second had been my mother. I drove back to Lindenmere Drive that afternoon with my hands tight on the steering wheel the entire way. I want to be careful again about the language I use here, because I am aware that what I am describing is starting to sound like the kind of story that loses people. So I want to tell you, plainly, what I did next and why I did it. I went into my mother's basement. I moved the workbench. I looked at the steel door. I went back upstairs, and I called a locksmith from Salina who had no connection to anyone in Coldwater. I told him I had a door in my basement that had been sealed by a previous owner and that I needed to open it to inspect the foundation. He came out within 2 hours. He looked at the door for about 30 seconds, told me it was not a standard residential door, told me it was a pressure-rated steel hatch of the kind used for underground utility access, and told me he would not be able to open it without drilling through the hinges, which he was willing to do for $400 cash. I paid him. He drilled. The hinges took him 20 minutes apiece. When the second one gave way, the door tilted forward into my mother's basement and landed flat on the concrete with a sound that I felt in my back teeth. Behind the door was a passage. It was not a tunnel in the dramatic sense. It was a poured concrete corridor, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, lit by a single bare bulb on a pull chain that the locksmith found by sweeping his hand along the ceiling. The bulb came on. The corridor extended away from my mother's basement in a direction that, given the orientation of the house, would have run directly underneath the backyard, toward the easement. The locksmith looked at the corridor for a moment. He looked at me. He said, in the careful voice of a man who has just decided he wants to be paid and gone, that he was not licensed for confined space entry, and that if I was planning to go down there, I should not do so alone, and that he would not be coming with me. He took his $400 in cash. He left. He did not say goodbye, and he did not look back at the door as he climbed the basement stairs. I did not go down the corridor that day. I went down it on Wednesday. I want to explain why I waited 2 days, because the waiting is part of the story. On Monday night, after the locksmith left, I sat at my mother's kitchen table and I made phone calls. I called my brother in Seattle. He is 6 years older than me. He left Coldwater at 18 and has been back exactly twice in 26 years, both times for funerals. I asked him, without explaining why, whether our mother had ever told him anything about the house or the street or the people on it. He went quiet for a long time. Then he said something I am going to repeat exactly, because the phrasing mattered. He said, "Hannah, I left at 18 because Dad sat me down when I was 17 and told me that if I stayed past 19, I would not be allowed to leave. I thought he was being a strict father. I went to college and I never came back because by the time I figured out he wasn't being strict, I didn't want to test it. I'm sorry I never told you. I thought Mom would. I asked him if he knew about the easement. He said he did. He said our father had taken him out there once when he was 16 and had shown him a place in the grass where the ground sounded different when you stamped on it. He said our father had told him that the sound was the lid and that there was a room under it and that the room was older than the town and that the room was the reason the town existed at all. He said our father had told him never to go down there and never to ask who maintained it and never to come back to Coldwater to live. I asked him why he had never told me any of this. He said he had assumed our mother would when I was old enough. He said he had assumed when I went to college and stayed in Cincinnati and built a career and didn't move back, that she had told me and I had simply made the same decision he had. He said he was sorry. He said it twice. He asked me to leave the house and not go back. I told him I would think about it. On Tuesday morning, I called the attorney. I asked him whether the clause in my mother's will, the one that prohibited the sale of the house, was legally enforceable. He said it was unusual but not unprecedented. He said the standard remedy for a beneficiary who wanted to violate such a clause was to petition the probate court to set it aside. He said the process would take 6 to 9 months and that I had a reasonable likelihood of success, since the clause did not name a charitable beneficiary or a successor purchaser, and was therefore arguably an unreasonable restraint on alienation. I asked him if he had ever drafted a similar clause for another client. He said he had. He said he had drafted 4 others in his career, all for clients who lived on Lindenmere Drive, and that he was the 3rd generation of his family's law firm to do so. He said his grandfather had drafted the first one in 1948. I asked him if he knew why. He said he had asked once when he was a young man, and his father had told him that the firm did not ask, and that the firm did not refuse, and that the firm was paid quite well for the discretion. He said he hoped I was doing all right. He said it the way you say it when you suspect you already know the answer. On Wednesday afternoon, I went down the corridor. I brought a flashlight, my phone, a wrench from my father's workbench, and a notebook. I did not bring anyone with me. I want to acknowledge that this was a poor decision. I made it anyway, because I had reached a point where I needed to see the thing before I could decide what to do about it, and because I was not willing to give the people on the street the satisfaction of knowing I had been afraid. The corridor was longer than I expected. I counted my paces. The walls were dry. The air did not smell stale, which surprised me. It smelled the way the basement smelled of cool concrete and old paint and the faint mineral edge of well water, but no stronger, and no different from one end of the corridor to the other. The bulb in the ceiling cast a yellow circle of light at the start of the corridor, and a second bulb, which I had not seen from the door, came on about halfway down when I stepped under its chain. Whoever maintained the corridor had thought about lighting. Whoever maintained the corridor had thought about ventilation. Whoever maintained the corridor had thought, in fact, about every detail except the one that mattered most, which was making the corridor difficult to find in the first place. I had walked 72 feet before the corridor opened into a chamber. The chamber was circular. The walls were stone, not concrete. Old stone, dry-fitted, the kind of work that predates Portland cement. The ceiling was wooden beams. The beams were dark with age and stained at the bottoms in a way that suggested water had risen to that level many times over many years. The floor was packed earth. In the center of the floor was a circular stone wellhead, capped with an iron lid. The lid had a ring set into it. The ring was polished from use. Around the wellhead, set into the dirt floor at regular intervals, were 12 low wooden stools. Each stool had a name carved into the seat. The stool nearest to me had my father's name on it. The stool next to it had my mother's name. The stool next to that one had mine. I stood in that chamber for what I later estimated, from the timestamps on my phone, was 4 minutes and 30 seconds. I did not touch the wellhead. I did not touch the stools. I took 11 photographs and 1 short video, and then I turned around and walked back through the corridor and up into my mother's basement and out into her kitchen, and I sat at her table for a long time with my hands flat on the wood, because I was shaking and I did not want to be shaking when I made the next call. The carving on the stool with my name had been done a long time ago. That was the part I could not stop thinking about. The letters were worn at the edges, in the way that wood wears when fingers have rested on it many times. Not the way wood wears in a single afternoon of carving. Not the way wood wears in a year. The way wood wears across decades. Whoever had carved my name into that stool had done it within months of my birth, and someone in that room, someone on that street, had been resting their hand on the seat of it ever since, polishing the wood with patience, keeping the place ready. The next call was not to the police. I want to say why, because I have thought about that decision a great deal in the months since, and I think the reasoning matters. What I had seen in the chamber was not a crime scene. It was a room with a well and 12 stools. The stools had names carved into them, including mine, but a name carved into a stool is not, by itself, a threat that a police officer in a small Ohio town would understand how to act on. And the police in Coldwater, I had begun to suspect, were not a separate institution from the street. The chief of police, when I checked, had grown up 2 blocks from Lindenmere Drive. His mother still lived there. His department's headquarters, when I pulled the public budget for the city of Coldwater, had been re-roofed in 2019 by Pelham Roofing and Exteriors on a no-bid municipal contract that had been approved by a city council whose chairman was Mr. Hendler's brother-in-law. So the next call was to my brother. I told him what I had found. I told him about the chamber, the wellhead, the stools, the names. I told him about the articles of maintenance from 1861 and the photograph from the 1920s. I told him about the rotation schedule with the letter K next to our mother's name, and the spring called Kettering's Mouth, and the fact that 12 houses had been built in a curve around it in 1952 to replace the original 12 houses, which had presumably been built in 1851, to replace whatever had been there before that. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was done, he said something I had not expected him to say. He said, "Hannah, get out of the house tonight. Don't pack. Don't try to take anything. Get in the car and drive to Cincinnati and call me when you're on the highway." I told him I couldn't leave yet. He asked me why. I told him about the meeting on Friday. I told him my name was on the rotation, that it had been on the rotation since I was 1 year old, and that I did not know what the rotation actually was, but that I had begun to suspect it was the schedule of who sat on which stool, and that I needed to know what happened when someone sat on a stool before I decided whether to spend the rest of my life worrying about it from a distance. He said, "Hannah, that's the trap. The trap is that you think understanding it will protect you. It won't. Understanding is what binds you." Mom understood. Dad understood. They both stayed. I told him I would think about it. I did think about it. I thought about it for the rest of Wednesday afternoon and all of Wednesday night, sitting in my mother's living room with every light on and the curtains drawn and my car keys in my pocket and my phone fully charged on the side table. I thought about it the way the work had taught me to think. I made 3 columns in my head, the way I would for any difficult property, and I sorted what I knew into them. The first column was for the things I could verify. 12 households on Lindenmere Drive had been engaged in a coordinated maintenance program for over a century and a half. The program was tied, in some way, that the original 1861 document called a benefit, to a spring or well or underground water feature lying beneath the easement at the center of the street. The program had a written schedule. The schedule had assigned me a position before I was old enough to speak. My parents had spent their adult lives keeping my position dormant. My brother had been told the rules at 17 and had left. My mother had not told me the rules, had instead written me letters she never mailed, had instead negotiated with the other 11 households for 30 days of grace after her death. The second column was for the things I could reasonably infer. The people on the street were not malevolent in the way fiction usually describes them. They were not cruel. They were not violent. They were a maintenance crew. They had a schedule. They followed it. They had, in fact, been remarkably patient with me, in the way that experienced tradespeople are patient with a client who does not yet understand what they are looking at. Mr. Brunson had not threatened me on the porch. He had explained the work order. He had given me a clipboard. The neighbors had not knocked on my windows in the night. They had not blocked my driveway. They had stayed in their houses. They had let me work. The third column was for everything I had no way to measure, and which therefore did not belong on the form at all. The well itself. What was under it? What the 1861 document meant by benefit. Whether the contract was metaphysical or chemical or psychological, or some combination of those things. That column stayed empty. I left it empty deliberately. A good report does not pretend to assess what the assessor cannot reach. By Thursday morning, I had decided. I went to the meeting on Friday. I want to explain that decision too, because it is the one that has cost me the most sleep. I did not go because I had decided to accept my place on the rotation. I went because I had decided that the only way to leave Coldwater permanently, in a way that would not require me to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, was to walk into the basement of the Brunson house and tell 11 people, in person, that I was breaking the schedule and that they would need to find someone else. The letter Mr. Brunson had given me said the next meeting was at 7 on Friday evening. I wanted to be in the room when the schedule was being kept, not after, because I did not want any of them to be able to claim later that they had not heard me say it. I dressed for it the way I dress for a difficult appraisal. Slacks, a dark blouse, flat shoes, a jacket with inside pockets, in which I had placed a folded copy of the 1861 Articles of Maintenance, a copy of my mother's letter from 2019, a small voice recorder set to record continuously, and the keys to my car. I parked the car at the curb in front of my mother's house, pointed toward the end of the street, with a quarter tank of gas, more than I would need to reach Cincinnati. I left the front door of the house unlocked. I left a bag packed on the kitchen table. I walked across the backyard at 6:50 in the evening. The grass in the easement was very short, recently mowed, the cuttings raked away. The ground, when I stepped on it, did not sound hollow. It sounded the way grass over soil sounds. I want to note that, because I had half expected, after my brother's description, to hear something. I did not. Whoever had told my brother about the lid had told him about a part of the easement I was not crossing, or had been describing something that was no longer there, or had been describing something only certain people could hear. The Brunson back door was unlocked. The basement stairs were down the hall to the right. I went down them. The basement was finished, paneled in the kind of dark wood that was popular in the late 1970s, with a low ceiling and a single overhead fluorescent fixture casting a flat, even light. There was a long table in the center of the room. Around the table were 11 people. I recognized all of them. Mr. and Mrs. Brunson, Mr. and Mrs. Hendler, Mrs. Marwick, Mr. Pelham. Two of the families I had not known well as a child, the Vossers and the Kletts, both husbands and wives. And, sitting at the far end of the table, two people I had not seen in 19 years, my high school chemistry teacher, Mr. Riggle, and his wife, who had moved into the house at the end of the street, the one the Lindquists had lived in before they died in 2004. There were 12 chairs at the table. The chair at the near end was empty. Mr. Brunson stood up. He said good evening. He said they were glad I had come. He said, before they began the regular business of the meeting, that they wanted to give me the opportunity to ask any questions I had. I did not sit down. I took the articles of maintenance out of my jacket pocket and I laid them on the table. I said I had 3 questions, and that I would ask them in order, and that I would decide what to do based on the answers. The room was very quiet. My first question was whether anyone at the table had ever sat on the stool with their name on it. Mr. Pelham, the oldest person in the room, said yes. He said he had sat on his stool 4 times in his life. He said each time corresponded to what the original document called a benefits cycle, and that the cycles came at irregular intervals, sometimes 10 years apart, sometimes 30, and that the schedule could not predict them, only respond to them. He said sitting on the stool was not what people imagined. He said it was a transaction. He said the person on the stool offered the well a small portion of their remaining years, and in exchange the well extended the lives and the homes and the prosperity of the other 11 households until the next cycle. He said it did not feel like dying. He said it felt like sleeping for an afternoon. He said you woke up and you had less time left than you'd had that morning, but that you didn't notice it until later, sometimes years later, when you realized you were tired in a way that didn't match your age. My second question was whether anyone at the table had ever refused to sit on the stool. Mrs. Marwick answered. She said 2 people in the history of the street had refused. She said the first had been a man named Holcomb in 1903, and that he had been replaced by the other 11 households within a year, by means she said she did not know and did not want to know, but that the replacement was final. She said the second had been Mrs. Otwell in 1998. She said Mrs. Otwell had put her house on the market after refusing her rotation, and that the other 10 households had not replaced her immediately, because my mother had asked them to wait, because my mother had hoped Mrs. Otwell would change her mind. Mrs. Otwell had not changed her mind. The replacement had occurred in 1999. Mrs. Marwick said she was sorry. She said my mother had cried for a week. My third question was whether my name could be removed from the rotation. The room went quieter than it had been. Mr. Brunson sat down. He looked at his hands on the table for a long time. Then he said that, in the history of the street, a name had been removed from the rotation exactly twice. The first time had been in 1887, when a child on the street had died of diphtheria at age 4, before her cycle came up. The second time had been in 1962, when a family had sold their house to outsiders and left the state, and the well had accepted the replacement family in their place. He said the well did not, as far as anyone at the table knew, permit a name to be removed by request. He said the well permitted names to be removed by death or by replacement, and that those were the only mechanisms anyone had ever observed. I asked him what would happen if I sold the house. He said the well would accept the buyers, in time, the way it had accepted the Riggles in 2004, and that my name would be replaced on the rotation by the name of whoever held the deed. He said this would take, in his experience, between 18 months and 3 years. He said the buyers would not know what they were buying. He said this had always been true. He said the people on the street were not, despite what I might be thinking, the architects of the system. They were, as his father had told him, the maintenance crew. The well had been there before them. The well would be there after them. Their role, as they understood it, was to keep the schedule and to ensure that the houses changed hands quietly so that the work could continue. I asked him if he was telling me that I could sell the house and walk away, and that the only cost would be the lives of whoever bought it. He said yes. He said it without flinching, and without apology, and without trying to make it sound like anything other than what it was. He said that this was the choice every person on the street had made at one point or another, including my mother, who had inherited the house from my father's mother in 1991, and had decided after one cycle of consideration to stay rather than sell because she had not been willing to put strangers into the rotation in her place. He said my mother had been, in his words, a better person than the street deserved. I stood at the head of that table for a long time. I took the recorder out of my jacket pocket. I set it on the table, still running. I said, for the record, that I was Hannah Reeve, and that I was the daughter of Patricia and David Reeve, and that I was the owner of the house at 4418 Lindenmere Drive in Coldwater, Ohio, and that I was refusing my rotation, and that I was not going to sell the house to anyone, and that I was going to walk out of this basement and out of this town and never come back. I said I understood what they had told me about the precedent. I said I did not care. No one at the table tried to stop me. No one at the table raised their voice. Mr. Pelham looked down at his hands. Mrs. Marwick closed her eyes. Mr. Brunson nodded once, slowly, in a way that I could not read as either acceptance or threat, only as the small acknowledgement of a man who had heard, in his lifetime, a sentence he had not expected to hear. I picked up the recorder. I picked up the articles of maintenance. I walked up the basement stairs and out through the Brunson kitchen and across the easement in the dark, and the grass under my feet still sounded like grass. I packed a single bag from my mother's bedroom, her wedding photograph, her wedding ring, the crossword from the kitchen table, the stack of envelopes from the casserole dish. Nothing else. I left the lights on. I left the doors unlocked. I drove out of Coldwater at 9:40 in the evening, and I did not look in the rearview mirror until I was on the state route, and when I did look, there was nothing behind me but the road. I have not been back. That was 14 months ago. The house is still mine. I have not sold it. I have paid the property taxes from a checking account I keep separate from the rest of my finances. I have not rented it. I have not listed it. The grass in the yard has grown long, and the neighbors, I assume, are still mowing the easement because the city of Coldwater does not have a complaint on file for the property, and I check the municipal record every month. In the months since, I have learned a few things that I want to set down before I finish. The first is that my brother was wrong about one thing. Understanding does not always bind you. Sometimes understanding is what lets you leave. I left because I understood. The people on the street stayed because they understood. The difference, I think, is what each of us was willing to spend to keep our understanding intact. The second is that I do not know, and will probably never know, what is actually underneath the easement. There is a well. The well is old. The original document called it a benefit and described the relationship between the well and the households as a kind of contract. Whether that contract is metaphysical or chemical or psychological or some combination of those things is not something I have the tools to answer. My work has always ended where the measurable ends. It ended there on Lindenmere Drive, too. The third is that I have started receiving phone calls in the last 6 weeks from a number with a cold water area code that does not appear in any directory. The calls come at irregular intervals, sometimes twice in a single afternoon, sometimes nothing for 10 days. They do not leave voicemails. When I have answered them, there has been no voice on the other end, only the sound of a room with a low ceiling and stone walls and the faint, slow sound of water moving somewhere underneath it. I do not answer them anymore. I am writing this down because my mother wrote 30 letters to me over 19 years and never mailed a single one, and because the cost of her silence was that I walked into that basement on a Friday evening without knowing what I was walking into, and because if I have a child someday, I do not want them to learn what I learned the way I learned it. I want them to know that there is a street in Ohio with 12 houses on it, and that they own one of them, and that they should never, under any circumstances, go back to claim it. I want them to know that the people on the street are not bad people. They are tired people. They are people who made a choice a long time ago, and who have spent their lives keeping that choice from being noticed, and who will, when their time on the rotation comes, sit down on a stool with their name on it and give up a part of themselves so that the houses they live in can stand for another generation. I want them to know that the choice can be refused. I want them to know that refusing it costs less than my mother thought it would. And I want them to know, because I owe them this last piece of honesty, that some nights I still hear the sound of that room when the house is quiet, and that I do not know whether the sound is in my memory or in the phone line or in the walls of wherever I happen to be sleeping, and that the not knowing is the part I have learned to live with, because the alternative would be to drive back to Coldwater and lift the iron ring on the wellhead and look down, and I am not going to do that. I am not going to do that. That is the part of the choice I get to keep making every day for the rest of my life. And I am making it.